Hi, everybody. Here we are. Everybody here okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, welcome. It's just afternoon, so we'll jump in and get started. Thank you for joining us. My name is Russ Carnegie, and I'm president at Preservation Action. And we also have Rob Naylor here, our associate director, and Emily, where's Emily? And Emily Evans, who does communications and operations and everything. Come on in, don't be shy. And we have a great panel here today. We have some food and refreshments up here. Please help yourself. Just want to start off with a few introductions and welcomes. First of all, Preservation Action is a 501c4 nonprofit organization created back in 1974. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary. It is the national grassroots lobby for historic preservation. And we work with empowering grassroots communities on historic preservation issues and engage with the national network of allied organizations, many of whom you're going to meet here today. And this is May. It's Historic Preservation Month, in case you didn't know it. It's a time to kind of celebrate all things with historic preservation. And I actually Googled this morning the history of Historic Preservation Month. And a few things came up I wanted to share. So under the National Trust for Historic Preservation's website, it said our Preservation Month theme of, quote, saving places is a national high five to everyone doing the great work of saving places and inspiring others to do the same. Under the National Park Service website, it said during the month of May, many events are planned to promote historic places for the purpose of instilling national and community pride, promoting heritage tourism, and showing the social and economic benefits of historic preservation. And finally, the Old House Journal in May. Preservation groups, historical societies, organizations, and related businesses celebrate our country's diverse and unique heritage and historic preservation with Historic Preservation Month. Again, this is why we're here now. And also want to thank our sponsors that help us with programming and the events we do throughout the year. The law firm of Nixon Peabody, PBX Group, Campo Architects and Design, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Trust for Community Investment Corp., and the Unico Systems. And thank you all for being here. I want to next go to, we have representatives from Congressman Blumenauer and Congressman Turner's offices. They are bipartisan co-chairs of the Historic Preservation Caucus, which I was pleased to be one of the co-chairs when I was in the House, to see that great group continuing to advocate and work for issues and provide leadership here on the Hill. And let's start with Tucker Johnson. Tucker, you come up and say a brief greeting.
Thank you for the introduction. It is great to have you all here. I won't bore you with too much about historic preservation. We've got a group of actual experts here to tell you about what it means, but the Historic Preservation Caucus is a great group here on the Hill. I know my boss enjoys leading it, Congressman Turner. It's great working with Dave on it. We put together a Historic Preservation Appropriations Letter every year. Many of your bosses may have joined that. Historic preservation is, even if you're not aware of it right now, it's happening in your district and it's got a huge impact. So it's a great group to be connected with and a great group of advocates to work with.
Thank you. And next, David Stratton from Congressman Turner's office. David.
Thank you all for being here. Like Tucker said, historic preservation is really important to my boss. Just to give you some context for our congressional district, District 10, Congressman Turner represents about 238 National Historic Register listings and more than 7,000 historic sites and nearly 3,000 archaeological sites. So the scope and impact just in Ohio 10 is huge of what we are trying to do out here in Washington. And I'm sure, as Tucker again mentioned, that will ring true for your boss's congressional district. We're proud to work with our co-chair of the Historic Preservation Caucus, Representative Blumenauer, advocate for historic preservation across the country, and we really appreciate all of you being here this afternoon. Thank you.
Please give our continued thanks to the congressman for their leadership of the caucus. We really, really appreciate that, and it really makes a difference for all of us. We have up here, we're going to cover these topics today, again, through a number of experts. You have like top leaders from the top historic preservation organizations in the country here to give you a quick overview. We're going to cover historic preservation. What is it? The Historic Preservation Fund, state historic preservation offices, tribal historic preservation offices, competitive grant programs, the federal historic tax credits, and the economic benefits of historic preservations, and finally site visits that many members have done and gotten a lot of knowledge, but I think personal appreciation of some of the things going on in their districts. So let's go to our panel. I feel like we're on a game show here. But we have first up Christina Hingle. She is the Director of Government and External Affairs at the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. Christina, take it away.
Thanks so much, Russ. Thank you all for coming here today. If you're just here for the free lunch and stay out of the rain, that's fine too. But hopefully we can learn a little bit about historic preservation. I really have the fun part of this presentation because I get to tell you a little bit about the history of historic preservation, why it's so important in all of our communities and all your districts and your boss's districts. And then I can get into a little bit more detail specifically about each of those priority areas, which are the state historic preservation offices, and our role in supporting those offices and the work that they do every single day. So starting with the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, this certainly wasn't the first time historic preservation came to be. Folks had been doing historic preservation for many, many years before that. Certainly the Mount Vernon Ladies Association had been doing it, before the turn of the century, late 1800s, and then of course locally in a lot of places on a local level. A lot of people have always been really interested in preserving those historic places that mean so much to us. So again, when NHPA came about, what we were seeing was a lot of urban renewal, right? And with urban renewal was a lot of inherent destruction to historic assets. So something good that came out of that was NHPA, which was really Congress recognizing in a very comprehensive way our dedication, our commitment to preserving our nation's history so that all the generations that follow can really appreciate it. So with that came the creation of the National Register of Historic Places, which you heard a couple of folks mention already today. Again, honoring those sites that have importance to us. And this is something that our state historic preservation offices deal a lot with in determining if there is a site eligible for listing on the National Register. Another thing that we saw come out of this was the ACHB, or the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, who you might have done some work with. It's a federal agency responsible for administering some of the requirements of NHPA. There were particularly details dealing with Section 106. So when there's a federal undertaking with the likelihood to impact a historic resource, they will be part of that Section 106 review process. And again, Section 106 also came out of NHPA. And just so there's no confusion, when Section 106 came about, it was originally named after its location in the law, and it has since moved. So you will no longer find it in Section 106. So it does not quite make any more sense, but that is a question we get fairly often. And then, of course, State Historic Preservation Offices, or SHPOs, came out of the Act as well. And then I'll just mention, which you'll hear from John later, TIPOs were later added as an amendment. So Tribal Historic Preservation Offices as well. So at McShippo, we support the work of the State Historic Preservation Offices, as I mentioned, and we do have 59 of them. So the first 50, pretty easy to guess, 50 United States, each of them has a State Historic Preservation office that represents historic preservation interests. And then we also have the 5 territories, the 3 freely associated states, and of course the District of Columbia. So we have a lot of offices and a lot of staff really dedicated to preserving historic preservation in our communities. So I will mention that while they do a lot of the same functions, depending on where they are geographically, there's a lot of difference in how they operate. There's also some differences depending on what agency they're housed in. They could be a standalone agency, or they could be housed under a bigger agency like economic development or planning. There's also more that are like historical commissions or museums even. So they all kind of function in different ways, some similar to others, but also some very dissimilar. And so with that work, they are mainly tasked with surveying historic properties, as I mentioned, maintaining those historic inventories, nominating properties to the National Register. They also do a statewide preservation plan every so many years, as well as providing technical assistance to a variety of stakeholders. So a lot of work that they do, and they also do a lot of work on the state level. So a lot of the states might have their own preservational ordinances or laws that they need to administer, and also do a lot of work in terms of promoting heritage tourism. They might administer their own grant programs, and some might even own museums or historic sites. So again, a lot of difference there. So one thing I wanted to talk about quickly was the Historic Preservation Fund, which all of us, of course, are very involved with as a primary source of funding for historic preservation in the United States. And this funding is so important and crucial to all of preservation, but particularly for our SHPOs. It really helps them meet their capacity and being able to meet all these things that I've just mentioned that they do so well, and being able to promote historic preservation in their jurisdiction. As well as being a source of funds for TIPOs and for competitive grant programs in historic preservation that you're going to hear a little bit more about later as well. So these funds do really great things like rehabilitate historic sites, revitalize our communities, and really create some of those opportunities for economic growth that I know a lot of your bosses are particularly interested in, and we are as well, and really glad that historic preservation can kind of be a driver of those efforts. So I will point out that this is not taxpayer-funded program. It does have a small percent of royalties that energy companies pay into this fund for the right to drill for oil and natural gas on the outer continental shelf. And so I'll just point out that to this, the concept really from the beginning was that the creation of this in this way was to take one non-renewable resource and save another with it. So to save historic preservation. So it doesn't replace it, but it does kind of do good. So that was kind of the initial thought of the bringing on. So a little bit later, my colleagues are going to speak a little more broadly to the importance of increased appropriations under the HPF and our goals in reauthorizing the program, which we're definitely supportive and look forward to continuing work on. But I wanted to share here some SHPO-centric outcomes that really show how far this funding goes in the work that the SHPOs do. And so for the SHPOs for FY24, we're looking for $78 million in appropriations. And just to give you a benchmark, we're currently at $62 million. So all those responsibilities that I mentioned earlier can't be done without SHPO staff, resources, and as we all know, everything is getting so expensive. Gone to the grocery store lately, I know you know your money's not going as far, so our SHPOs are facing the same kind of struggles there. The other thing that I will point out, so if you look at the list, there's 98,000 National Register listings. You know, this is staff going out and doing the work to certify these properties as historic. The federal undertakings bit is going to be Section 106 reviews, obviously surveying for cultural resources or all the surveys that they do, and then also National Register opinions, which may or may not lead to National Register nomination. And just to point out, we did have a change with the SHPO apportionment formula this year. So this year, 23 states did not see an increase in their funding from fiscal year 22 to 23. So that's definitely something that we're really watching and concerned about in terms of not having the money that the folks need to do all this work. And the other thing that SHPOs are particularly concerned about is with all the infrastructure spending, they want to make sure that they have the capacity to do all those upcoming reviews. And again, that all takes resources. So that's one thing that is kind of on their docket in terms of priorities right now. So that was the 100-foot, very quick overview. I know we have a lot of folks to get to today. Hopefully that was helping and kind of set the stage for some of these things that we'll explore a little bit more in depth. I have included a QR code here if you want to scan your phone real quick. SHPO just dropped a report that outlines some upcoming recommendations for ways we can continue talking about improving historic resources and recommendations on National Register and stuff like that. So happy to answer questions now or later, and just appreciate the time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Christina. Next, we're going to hear from John Sobel. He's a Senior Government Relations Specialist in the Government Relations Practice at Jenner and Bob, and he's here on behalf of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. John.
Thank you. This has been described as a panel of experts. It's not true. It's 4 experts and me, just a dude. So I want to talk a little bit, just first of all, what are tribal historic preservation officers? Basically, tribal historic preservation officers, in a broad sense, they are designated by the Department of Interior to assume the role of the state historic preservation officers. So, how do they differ? Well, number one, we would say that our mission is a little broader. We are preserving a specific culture within the tribe. Sometimes, oftentimes, we are going out and we're, exploring the actual sites where there might be energy development, infrastructure development, but they also do other things that are more specific to the peoples, which is that language preservation, things of that nature. So we're not trying to elevate ourselves over anyone here, but it is a kind of a core function within tribes that for social reasons, for under law, have been scattered, have been oppressed historically, and a lot of that culture was kind of, as they were, forcibly removed, and we are trying to reclaim that before it is lost in history. So that's it. And to some degree, I think the tribal historic preservation officers are a victim of their own success. When this program started, when they were first funded back in 1996, there were 12. Right now we have over 200. So that pie is getting sliced more and more and more and more. And obviously, in most ways, we like that. We want every tribe and every tribal entity to have a tribal historic preservation officer. The problem is the funding doesn't necessarily keep up with that. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to share what we do, and B, of course, expand the funding. And I'll save the PBS style pitch for the end here. One thing that often comes up is, well, hey John, first of all, why are you talking to me? Second, I don't have any tribes in my district, in my boss's district. Well, great, but we actually some of our best advocates don't have tribes in their district, and I would argue that sometimes that frees you up a little bit politically, because you don't have to worry about any sort of ramifications back home, for better or worse. So again, some of our best friends haven't had tribes in their district. Well, they did at one point sometimes, but no longer do. So we embrace those folks because, again, we think they probably have the most latitude in making decisions. Again, we're essential to preserving culture. Our tribal historic preservation officers often need to work extremely quickly when a request comes before them. And keep in mind that there's a stereotype with tribes, and I hear it all the time. It's, oh yeah, they got a lot of casinos. Well, I can tell you right now, there are 574 tribes and tribal entities. There are not 574 rip-roaring casinos that are funding everything. We do have some tribes that are pretty lucky, and for every one of them, I don't know, there's probably a dozen, 15 that are struggling to keep the lights on. So oftentimes, whether or not you're an economically prosperous tribe or not, the tribe ends up trying to supplement budgets and supplement the functions of the tribal historic preservation officers because that funding is so scarce. And while we're happy that our tribes are able to do that sometimes, we shouldn't be relying on that. It's not really a great way to move forward. Let's see, beyond that, we're looking for 34 mil in the entire scheme of things, not a very big number. We did get a decent increase last time, last fiscal year. However, keep in mind, because the number of TIPOs has increased so much, it really just brought us roughly to a level as when the program started back in 1996, if you account for inflation. So again, we're here as part of the team. We really believe in what TIPOs are doing. And for those of you that kind of look at it and say, well, what if a tribal historic preservation officer goes out there, there's a development project, aren't they just sort of getting in the way whether or not the claim is legitimate? I would say it actually can help. It can help development, it can help these projects, because you really need to have that conversation as to what's out there, what was there, what is the cultural impact of this energy project, of this infrastructure. And you probably want to do that at the front end. It only gets worse on the back end. So for that reason alone, I think, again, I know a lot of us are pro-development and know that these sometimes projects have to happen, but this really does help to work toward that goal, but preserve the culture and preserve the rights of the tribe. So our TIPOs try to be as cooperative as possible. I think they do great work. And we appreciate your consideration of our request and the request from the group. And thank you all for listening.
Great. Thank you, John. Next up, we have Sean Sprague. He is the Vice President for Government Relations at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And he's also designated by the Chairman of the National Trust as the representative on our Preservation Action Board, and pleased to work with him. Sean.
Thank you, Ross. Great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. We really appreciate your coming today. Historic preservation is something that we're all very passionate about, and it's great to have the opportunity to explain a little bit more about what we do, why we do it, and some of the results of the work and the ways that Congress supports historic preservation. So I have the benefit of talking about the grant programs associated with the Historic Preservation Fund, and show some pictures, so that's always helpful. From a 30,000 foot view standpoint, as Christina mentioned, there are a number of grant programs that are included within the HPF. Here they are on this chart, which goes back a couple fiscal years, as well as the enacted levels, the administration's request, and then our group's request for fiscal year 24. What you'll see from some of these programs is let me move back up. One of the critiques, if you will, of how historic preservation is done in this country is that it hasn't preserved the diverse history that exists within the United States. And a lot of these grant programs are designed to address some of the lesser known stories that really without congressional support could be lost forever. And so you'll see some examples of the work of these grant programs and what they're doing, which I think you'll find pretty inspiring. And what are they achieving? So they're helping to preserve the full history of our country. They're promoting economic revitalization in communities. and they're improving the stewardship of our existing sites that have been recognized as nationally significant in some way or another. So for a few examples, so I'm sorry, just back up one. So this chart, you can be, we produce a report on historic preservation priorities, which includes Historic Preservation Fund, but also other programs outside of HPF that supports historic preservation. You can find this full report at savingplaces.org, including this handy chart. Thank you. Next slide, please. So one of the larger grant programs within, the larger and long-standing grant programs within HPF is Save America's Treasures. This is was funded last enacted levels at $26.5 million. Here are a couple examples of the types of projects that get funding through SAT. This is the Colorado Chautauqua. This was the first picture on the left in Boulder, Colorado. This was built in 1898. A lot of interesting history there around the Chautauqua movement of the turn of the century. And this is a great example. This is a National Historic Landmark, and they used $280,000 from an SAT grant for wildfire mitigation. So that was an example of how SAT is helping to address some of the climate concerns associated with our most important historic sites. The next picture is of the Barnum Museum in Connecticut, in Bridgeport. This building was built in 1893 and is the last sort of remnant of the legacy of P.T. Barnum and the circus and the way that changed family entertainment during the era. They used $500,000 from SAT to replace all those beautiful windows and their hair. Sorry. And the last one is just another example. This is the San Esteban del Rey Mission Church, which was built in 1629. It's on the lands of the Acoma Pueblo Reservation, and which is credited with being one of the oldest continuously operating communities in the country. This is a National Historic Landmark in 1970, and we are seeking $40 million for fiscal year 24 for SAT. African American Civil Rights Grants. This program is designed to help preserve the sites and stories associated with the 20th century civil rights movement and the effort to gain equal rights. The program is divided into two portions. One is designed to actually provide rehabilitation and repair. The other is more on the history side, which is more like exhibits. But all these programs that I'm mentioning, funds can be used for bricks and mortar. So that's a key feature that not all federal programs have, that most of the historic preservation grant programs do allow. So here you have the on top the Wabash Avenue YMCA, a key place for African Americans to obtain education and training. This was a place where African Americans could come in the South to reach new social and economic achievement. And then down below, the Loudonsboro, this is really testing my eyesight here, just like my height. Loudonsboro School is an example of a 19th century school for rural African American youth. But you can just see the different types of projects. So not all will be the same, small, large, across the board. We're doing a lot of good work to preserve that period of history. Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Grants. This was an important program for Senator Leahy. Paul Brune was his former chief of staff and historic preservation advocate, and so this program was renamed after him. It does direct revitalization grants to rural communities that are 50,000 in population or less, and it does some great work. The program is sub-granted, so often it's granted in $750,000 chunks, and then sub-granted out into the community. So you can see, on the top you have Minnesota Main Street program. A lot of the Main Street programs will be able to take advantage of this, and it helps preserve places like Sheldon Store, which is a former Grange Hall, preserving that important piece of our early rural and agricultural history. And we're seeing a lot of the Main Street communities. One of the big problems for communities like that look like that is upper story vacancy, and some of the Paul Brune grants have gone to study that and how you can revitalize and support the owners to rehabilitate and get people renting those upper stories, which are too often vacant. And then finally, underrepresented community grants. This is perhaps one of the more recent examples of the grant programs. It is a small grant program funded at $1.25 million in 23. We're looking for $5 million in funding here. What this does is help diversify the properties that are on the National Register. So the National Register, of course, is an avenue for technical assistance, grant programs, tax credits, and what we've seen is just the National Register is not nearly as diverse as our country, and so this program is helping to both add places to the National Register and amend existing National Register nominations to reflect some of the diverse histories that are part of those places on the register. So a petroglyph site in Rockingham, Vermont was a recent addition to have that nomination revised. And then Fort Totten Indian Industrial School in Benson County, North Dakota is another one that is the nomination is being done to reflect more of the Native American history there associated with that property and place in history. Again, happy to dive into details and ask questions of the panel on the specifics of the grant programs and who's eligible and when they are, and we can get into those details, but for now I'll pause there and come back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Next, we're pleased to have Forrest Miller. He is a partner at Nixon Peabody, focusing on historic tax credits, among other things. But he is also chairman of the National Historic Tax Credit Coalition. Forrest.
It looks like it's working. As you just heard, I'm with the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, and we specialize in the use of tax credits for financing transactions. Most of you are probably familiar with affordable housing is almost entirely financed with affordable housing tax credits, and renewable energy tax credits were a big part of last year's legislation. The historic tax credit dates back to 1981 and has been responsible for building more than 48,000 buildings being rehabilitated over the years. Managed to leverage $200 billion in private investment and created over 3 million jobs. So it is a very, very important part of the process by which we rehabilitate historic structures in America. Typically, a transaction involves the setting up of a partnership in which there is a developer and an investor, and the historic tax credit for much of its tenure has been a 20% tax credit. So if a project costs has $1 million in rehabilitation expenditures, it can generate a $200,000 tax credit, and an investor will often put up something like $250,000 towards that $200,000. So it actually raises more money for the tax credits, and that partnership enables a lot of these projects to be done. In 2022, leveraged more than $6.5 billion in private investment to rehabilitate more than 850 buildings, including 5,500 units of housing. It's a popular source of how to not just finance commercial properties, but also finance affordable housing. About half the projects are under $1 million, so it's not only for very large projects, lots and lots of projects are relatively small. 37 states also have state tax credits, so we see a lot of combining of the federal process with the state process as a way to find additional financing sources. Over the years, the historic tax credit has faced some measure of challenges. A few years back, it went from being a 20% all-in-one-year credit to a 4% per year times 5, so you have to collect the credits over 5 years. Obviously, when you do something like that, any change like that causes a slowing in the investment and makes a different group of investors as to whether or not they can use the investments over that period of time. And obviously, also with the pandemic, the construction industry, so things slowed that way as well. And finally, in recent years, the Affordable Housing Credit, which benefits from the Community Reinvestment Act, and so that banks invest in this because it gives them a particular bonus that they're looking for. And energy credits, of course, got much play in the most recent legislation. Sold, which is an even easier structure using a partnership structure, and they are a 30% credit as compared to a 20% credit. There are lots of competitive forces at play here, which have affected the utility of the historic tax credit. Even as we have those 48,000 buildings and $200 billion of investment. The Historic Tax Credit Coalition has proposed legislation which has been before Congress the last couple of years, referred to as the HTC Go Act. Okay, I didn't realize. 1785. Yes. It's 1785, and I simply hadn't gotten it to. So there is the story. These proposals in Congress are for the a proposal to increase on a short-term basis the credit from 20% to 30%, which is in the House version of the legislation. You have smaller projects under $2.5 million qualify for a 30% tax credit. To reduce the amount of expenditure that is required so as to facilitate the use of the credit, and to eliminate a basis adjustment. This is a very technical point, but I will emphasize that the way the credit works makes it not work as well as it could with low-income housing projects. And so this basis adjustment was eliminated with the historic and affordable housing much better. And lastly, there are an amazing number of super complex provisions that apply to projects for tax exempt entities. So we're talking about anything from a YMCA to a school building to museums and theaters. And as you might imagine, many of those buildings are among our most treasured historic structures. It can be very hard to do those kinds of projects. As it should say up there, House Resolution 1785 and Senate 639. Over the past few years, we've had in excess of 100 House co-sponsors, and I think last year we had 15 Senate co-sponsors. They are on both sides of the aisle. This is very much a bipartisan interest in Congress, and we ask that your offices consider being a co-sponsor.
Thank you, Boris. Next, we have Caitlin Cotton. She is the Director of Communications at Place Economics, the organization led by Don Rickma. They are experts in analysis of economic impacts of historic preservation. So all these public and private sector engagements around historic preservation, they've got some great data to tell you about the impact.
Thank you. So, like you said, our firm measures the economic impacts of historic preservation. So I'm going to share a selection of findings from our studies around the country, particularly the ways that historic preservation contributes to economic development, measurable in jobs, labor income, business creation, housing, property tax revenues to local governments. So the kind of impacts that residents of your district would see on the ground. And everything that we're able to measure is made possible in some way by the Historic Preservation Fund, whether it's funding SHPOs to review historic tax credit projects or certified local governments to create historic districts. Next slide. So you just heard about the federal historic tax credit program. We've done studies in states that have the state level historic tax credit programs to parallel the federal. And what we've found in those states is that for every dollar of tax credit provided by the state, we see an additional $8 to $12 of downstream economic activity created beyond the project, which is a huge ripple effect. How do you turn $12 out of $1? I'm glad you asked. Next slide. So every investment in historic preservation has a direct and indirect and induced impact. A direct impact happens within the project. So construction workers work on site, they receive a paycheck. Indirect impacts happen in the supply chain, so business to business transactions. So the contractor buys lumber from the lumberyard and that transaction supports jobs at the lumberyard. An induced impact comes from the household spending of labor income. So when both the construction worker at the tax credit project or the employee at the lumberyard spend their money in the local economy at the movie theater or the barbershop or the grocery store, those expenditures support jobs in the local economy. So you can see in Louisiana, my home state, which has a really strong state level historic tax credit, direct impacts on site created 1,700 jobs roughly, but almost the same number of jobs indirectly and induced outside of the project, which is a pretty high ratio, a really large ripple effect. The reason that historic preservation or historic rehabilitation has such a large ripple effect is historic rehabilitation is very labor intensive and the jobs that it creates are high paying. So when we say it's labor intensive, a larger share of the total project cost goes to labor than to materials. So in a rehab project, you're reusing building materials, which has great environmental impacts. But it also means that a larger share of that project budget goes to paychecks in pockets. So to human beings who are able to spend that money back home in local businesses. So these are local jobs, people spending money at businesses in their communities. We find the ratio typically for a rehabilitation project is 60% goes to labor, 40% to materials, and it's usually the reverse for a new construction project. These jobs are also well paid. So we did a national survey last summer of trades workers, trades experts, and they pretty consistently cited about a 9 to 10% wage premium paid to trades workers who have specifically preservation experience or experience working in historic buildings. So we compared this output, the multiplier effect of an investment made in historic rehabilitation with other top industries in Pennsylvania. So we found that when you invest $1 million in a historic building in Pennsylvania, 12 jobs are created, which is relatively high compared to other industries. About twice as many jobs for the same amount of investment. Next slide. You also heard about the competitive grant programs funded by the Historic Preservation Fund. We recently did a small analysis on just one of the grant programs made possible by the HPF, the Save America's Treasures Grant. And that has the same sort of ripple effect. So just one program in 1 year, one grant program in 1 year creates 600 jobs and $30 million in labor income. Next slide. So we talked about jobs. I want to talk about property tax revenues for local governments, because that's the income that cities and counties need to pay for police, pay for trash pickup. In Baltimore, they have a really effective local property tax incentive for rehabilitation for residential properties. It's hugely transformative in a city that struggles with really high residential vacancy rates in attracting population, and that has a ripple effect. But also in terms of increasing revenues for the local government. So this graph shows that, of course, properties that received investment through the local tax incentive, of course, their property values grew, and that meant increased revenues for the city. But what it also shows is that properties within 1,000 feet of the property that received the tax credit also saw a property value bump. So the city benefits both from the increased revenues from the project, but also properties in the vicinity. Next slide. A similar story in Macon, Georgia, which is like a wonderful southern rock city. We did a study there for a foundation that's been doing really intensive rehabilitation work in 3 near downtown neighborhoods for 2 decades now. And so of course, those neighborhoods benefited from increased property values. We found though that the rest of the city property values declined, and if values in those neighborhoods had performed the way the rest of the city had over that time period, the local government would have had $271,000 less to spend on services for residents each year. In Illinois, we did the same analysis, how much do local governments benefit from increased property taxes, from historic tax credit projects, but this time we put it in more tangible terms. So Illinois has this River Edge historic tax credit program. It's only available in 5 cities. 4 cities have used it and have completed projects. So across those 4 cities, local governments with the increased tax revenues from historic tax credit projects could hire 10 new teachers, 8 new police officers, 5 city maintenance workers, and still have enough money left over to provide rental subsidies for 163 families. So huge, huge benefits to local economies. And this isn't Chicago, this is Peoria, this is Rockford, and East St. Louis. So really spreading the benefit. So now I want to talk about the benefits of historic preservation more generally. So most cities have what are called local historic districts. They're designated historic areas, and within those districts, changes to buildings are regulated by a local commission. And they usually make up a very small percentage of the land area of the city, usually 1 to 7%. So though they are small, they are mighty. They are engines for their cities and produce really great economic benefits. Next slide. So in Buffalo, the historic districts make up 7% of the land area, and in 2019 accounted for 9% of all jobs. But over the last decade, they were the location of 48% of the city's overall job growth. So they're overperforming in terms of their land area. Cumberland, Maryland is a small city, but similar to Buffalo. It's a canal city that struggled from a loss of industry over the last 50 years. Over the last 15 years, they've seen really small, almost negligible job growth. But when you dive into where their small amount of job growth did happen, it wasn't in the city, it was specifically in the historic districts. And the rest of the city saw job loss. So it's not the business parks at the edge of town where they're seeing jobs coming in, they're seeing small businesses choosing to locate in historic districts is where their job growth is coming. So we talked about construction jobs earlier. These are jobs that are just choosing, businesses that are choosing to bring their jobs to historic buildings in historic districts. Speaking of small businesses, we find in a lot of our studies that historic buildings and historic neighborhoods are the location of choice for small businesses and startup businesses. So in Saratoga Springs, New York, another small town, 22% of all jobs are in historic districts, but 31% of all jobs at small businesses and nearly half of all jobs in new businesses are located in historic districts. Okay, so no presentation on the economic impacts of historic preservation is complete without talking about just general property values in historic districts. So we talked earlier about how obviously when you have a historic tax credit project, that increases the property value because you're making a huge investment. But when you're talking about just historic neighborhoods as compared to the rest of the city, controlling for rehabilitation activity in the historic district and general construction activity in the rest of the city, property values in historic districts outperform the rest of the city. And that's true in almost any city under any methodology. It's one of the most studied things. Historic districting has a positive impact on property values. Next slide. So often the opposition to a historic district is because people are afraid that it will negatively impact their property values, and it's just study after study has shown that that's not the case. This slide shows the change in property values in Buffalo's local historic districts compared to their national historic districts. Local historic districts have regulation, and that's normally what people are afraid will hurt their property values, is having to go to the commission to get, an addition approved. But study after study shows that's not the case. It's actually that layer of regulation which ensures that the character of your neighborhood is going to stay the same, that actually is what keeps property values very stable in historic districts, so they outperform the rest of the city in good times. Whenever there's a recession, they don't dip as low as the rest of the city. Because presumably a local district and a national registered district would have similar periods of construction, similar character, but it's really that layer of regulation that ensures property values stay stable. The last thing I just wanted to say is that there is often a misconnection between older housing and affordability across the country. So this graph shows the nationwide, the monthly median housing cost by year of construction. And every way we've looked at this, buildings constructed prior to 1979 have lower monthly owner and renter costs. So that's naturally occurring affordable housing that's not being subsidized. Where subsidies are used though, like the low-income housing tax credits, other researchers have found that it is cheaper to produce a LIHTC unit through acquisition and rehab than it is through new construction. And oftentimes developers will pair the historic tax credits with low-income housing tax credits to make these affordable projects more feasible. We did a study in Illinois looking at another state-level historic tax credit there, and we found that 90% of the units created under that, housing units created under that program were affordable. So there's a really great opportunity there to both, for historic preservation, to both preserve existing affordable housing and help create new affordable housing. So those are our findings.
Great, thank you, and thank you all, panel. And we just wanted to wind up by saying thank you for being here. You all got a packet with some background materials, and just really want to make a push for you all to speak with your offices and your bosses, your schedulers, especially back in the district, about doing a historic site visit. We have just numerous examples of members doing this, whether it's on the front end of a project or the back end of a project. Nothing can really paint the picture of the local impact more than actually being there, seeing it on the ground. And we've heard so many great comments. It's also a great PR thing, frankly, the great press around some of these visits, and also there's a great constituency of people that care about these things back home. So please take a look at that. If you want any other ideas that we can help through Preservation Action or through the Tax Credit Coalition, any of the groups here, to connect with projects back home, you'll find there are many of them. One of my favorite stories was a senator who we were trying to get on board with one of the tax credit programs, and he came to a program, and some of the tax credit developers had told about this local project that he knew about. He'd seen personally the transformation of this historic building that went from an eyesore to really a jewel. He got up and he said, I get it. He said, because he'd seen that example back home, and he signed on to the bill. So yeah, consider that something I think your members will enjoy, your staff will enjoy, and certainly back home has a big, big impact. Thank you for being here. Happy to answer any questions here as a group or informally afterwards. Please follow up. And we look forward to working with you and with your offices. Thank you so much.